Welcome to our first part of the post-reading discussion points. This is part 5. So let's go ahead and re-look at our post-reading discussion points that we had set out initially. We're going to recap them one by one in detail as we go through the rest of these slides. So at your own pace, see if you can participate in the discussion, challenge your mind to think about these as we go through them, and feel free to break this video down as you need to get through these. So number one, we're going to look at the art of telling a good story and what makes this one so good. Number two, literary strategies and devices that can be used by authors and that were used by this one, as well as some strategies for you as a reader. Number three, radio drama production. What is it that goes into radio drama in the first place? Number four, the theme of mass hysteria, and looking at that question, I think is relevant to our time here and now. Number five, popular media and human reaction to it. And in this case, we're looking at, as we know now, most definitely newspapers and radio as media during the late 1930s. Number six, humility, and the theme of humility, which Professor Pearson grasps toward the end of the story, is intelligence equal invincibility. Number seven, is technology our savior or our destroyer? Which is very similar to this idea of intelligence. I think we express our intelligence in technology. Is that something that is our savior or our destroyer? Number eight, the theme of the human spirit of survival. Are we just meant to survive? And number nine, the genre of science fiction. Science fiction writer H.G. Wells wrote several really interesting science fiction books that I've read, or stories that I've read. I would encourage you to look back at his writing. He wrote in the late 1800s, early 1900s, around that time. And so that's over 100 years ago at this point. And yet his stories are still captivating in the science that they depict, or the futuristic science that they depict. So a little bit on science fiction in point number 9. So let's get into it. Let's look at the art of telling a good story. So when you hear a good story, when you see a good story, when you watch a good story, when you read a good story, what makes it good? What are some things that make it good? There are a lot of things that people throw out there. Oh, great characters. Oh, great theme. An awesome location. An amazing set. Really cool special effects. So what makes a good story? And to be honest, it's a combination of a lot of things. You can't just have one good element of telling a good story and the rest suck and still tell a good story. They all need to work together. But I think that overall, for me, my reasons are this. Number one, realistic and believable. So how was our story realistic and believable, and how was it achieved that it could actually dupe people into thinking that it was real? Because when I like to enter a story, I like to be convinced that it's plausible and that there's a reality to it, and kind of enter into that world and not feel like it's a cheesy, corny world. And when I enter into the story of The War of the Worlds by Orson Welles, I don't think it's a cheesy world. I think it's depicted very accurately to the one that we live and exist in, and I can see myself within that world. So why was it so realistic and believable? Well, here's a couple reasons. Geography. The places mentioned in the story were actually real. We can point them out on a map, even to this day. And we can actually look at the directions, the street numbers, all these references to location, and pinpoint the flow of the story by looking at an actual map. So it was realistic because it occurred on the real map geography of planet Earth in the New York area. Now, another reason it's realistic is the way it mimicked radio. The breaks, the music, the interviews, the announcers, they all mimic that style of real radio. And that's going to convince us into thinking that it's a real world story. Another one is jargon. Jargon is the terminology that's kind of unique to a specific trade. And when somebody speaks a different type of jargon, it means they're kind of familiar with that, maybe profession or whatever. I know teachers have their own jargon all the time, and When teachers talk to non-teachers and use teacher jargon, other people are like, what? But same thing when I talk to engineers, for instance, and engineers use engineering jargon. I'm like, I don't know, I can only guess what you maybe mean by that term. But in any case, the jargon used in this is considered. They think about it. They don't just make everybody talk the same. So you have mimicked accents, military language, throwing a credibility of military jargon. You even have this educated professor language, or on the flip side, the uneducated farmer language to kind of give those characters that authenticity, that they speak a specific jargon and that you can kind of believe. They're not all the same. They don't use all the same vocabulary. They don't have all the same style of speaking. They know different terms because of their professions, so on and so forth. Okay, that's another reason. And I think another reason here is just the idea of suspense and the way the story is told. If the story is told with a good level of suspense and unpredictability, I know like there are stories we listen to or watch, and we can predict the outcome. And sometimes we're like, that's still a good story. I saw it coming. But what's really cool is when a story throws us off and we expect something, but it gives us something different. And so there's suspense in this story. First of all, the mystery and strangeness of the story itself draws us into it. I mean, who isn't captivated by extraterrestrial life or an invasion from another planet? Or the mystery of what are those explosions we're seeing on Mars? So these elements there that are like, oh, that's strange. Or it's always throwing you in suspense, like, oh, there was something that landed in Grover's Mill. We have a reporter going there in just a few moments. So then we're going to stay tuned in to be like, okay, well, what did he find there? So a story that's always drawing us to stay with the story or to keep reading the story because there's a suspense is also a quality of a good story. And I think overall, especially after the first half of the story or part one of the story, there's this impossibility of a victorious resolution to the story. It is impossible that humans would come back from this one. This story so far is setting itself up to be the annihilation of humanity as we know it. And that's suspenseful because we want to say, well, would a story actually do that? Would a story actually destroy humanity and give the earth to Martians, who we know very little about? And as we see, we listen in part two of the story, and we see a resolution that comes about that does end up restoring, thank goodness, Earth back to its original point. So, what are your top reasons that make a good story a good story? I think as you read from now and for the rest of your life, make a judgment. Is that story good or not? And what made it good? And I did say stories you read for the rest of your life. Guess what? You're watching movies and TV episodes all the time. Those are all stories too. They all started with writing. Somebody wrote down the screenplay or script to that story. So writers are all around us. And what makes writers able to tell a good story, I think, is a question that's kind of the backbone of my captivation with storytelling and authorship. Okay, because I don't know if I could tell as good a story as this, okay, or some other stories that authors tell, movies that I see. Okay, they're good stories. Now there are some that are terrible, and I'm like, I did not like the way that story was told. But be free with your judgment. You get to decide if the story's good or not, and have good reasons why, and also look at the qualities that make up the telling of a good story. So there's one theme for you: the art of telling a good story. Hopefully you have your own thoughts on that matter. So this next one is a few slides looking at literary strategies and devices. These are things for us to use as readers, but also things that authors have used to write their story. So as we read, we can employ various strategies to comprehend a text. We can also appreciate various literary conventions used by authors. These are techniques that are typically used by authors, and we can come to appreciate the literature that authors create. Again, this goes back to what I just said, and that is, can we appreciate the storytelling qualities within an author through their work? So we're going to review the skill of interpretation, the skill of inferencing, analogy as a literary device, and questioning the significance of titles and judging whether this is a good title or not, as well as using context clues to determine definitions while reading. And that is a skill of of comprehension of the words that are being used. So let's go dive into those 5 things. So the first one we're going to look at is interpretation. Authorship can be poetic, it can speak in metaphor, it can use complex vocabulary, but our task as English speakers is to rise to the challenge to interpret difficult texts. I always say, we know English, we learn English, we speak English, therefore we should be able to read English. As long as it's written in a way that's English and not, grammatically incoherent, we should be able to break it down and comprehend it. It is our language after all. Now, there certainly are more difficult, complex texts to read than not. That's why as a beginning reader, you don't start off with William Shakespeare. But as we grow to be experienced readers, we can tackle more and more difficult texts. And I think that sometimes we shy away from interpreting difficult texts rather than trying to face it and see if we can interpret those difficult texts. So here's a question. How would you recapture the meaning of the following excerpt from the beginning of the production? So here's an excerpt from the story, right from the beginning. It says, "We know now that as human beings busied themselves about their various concerns, they were scrutinized and studied, perhaps almost as narrowly as a man with a microscope might scrutinize the transient creatures that swarm and multiply in a drop of water. With infinite complacence, people went to and fro over the earth about their little affairs, serene in the assurance of their dominion over this small spinning fragment of solar driftwood, which by chance or design man has inherited out of the dark mystery of time and space." Now, this is Orson Welles at the beginning of the story, in person. This is not part of the characters in the script, but it actually makes a whole much more sense that we've read the story than it did at the beginning of the story. But that doesn't mean that we can't try to break it down into a terminology that we might understand a little bit better. So bear with us here. I know as soon as I bring my mouse down here, it's going to block this, so bear with us. I think it's a stupid Google Slides design, but here we are. So we know now. So now we know that as humans busied themselves about their various concerns, as we went about our problems and lived our lives day to day, we were being scrutinized and studied. We were being watched closely and studied, just like scientists with a microscope might scrutinize the creatures that swarm and multiply in a drop of water. So just like somebody might look at those creatures in a drop of water through a microscope. Unknowingly, with infinite complacence, yes, kind of complete ignorance, unknowingly, people went about their little affairs, their insignificant little businesses, with a false sense of peace, serene in the assurance, with this false sense of peace and confidence that they had ultimate power over this earth. And I like that, this spinning fragment of solar driftwood. Okay, well, we're a planet spinning through and floating through space, just like a piece of driftwood spins and floats through the ocean. Which by the chance or design man has inherited out of the dark mystery of time and space, meaning that we live on this planet which we have just inherited either from chance or design, so either by chance or by God, and we just kind of have inherited time and space, okay, or have just have had it given to us. This mystery of how we've come about here in the first place. So as we read that, we could break it down to language that we know, and that helps us interpret some of the themes as well as some of the words and meanings, I guess, of what's literally being said here. So go ahead and take this another chance. Go back to the beginning of the play, and if you wanted to read it through one more time on your own, see if you can actually pull out the meaning of what he's saying. And he's given us the message of the story before he's even told us the story. So we'll come back more on this when we talk about theme. So that's an idea of the lesson of interpretation. The next strategy we're going to look at is analogy. And so the analogy is a comparison that clarifies or illustrates a point by comparing things. And how is what the stranger says below an analogy? At some point in the second part, the stranger says, "Yeah, what's left of it. I was in the militia. National Guard, that's good. Wasn't any more war than there's war between men and ants." What does it mean? Well, that last part. Wasn't any war any more than there's war between men and ants. So what's the analogy here? The analogy is that war between men and ants would be completely futile for the ants, would be completely pointless. And that's how it was between humans and Martians, except in this instance, man and ants, Martians are the men, humans are the ants in the analogy. So ants are utterly defenseless against humans, just like humans were utterly defenseless against the Martians. The comparison or the analogy then in this instance, it's a very subtle analogy, but it's a comparison, and it shows us that vast power difference between two creatures and gives us a good insight to compare those things. So imagine ants feeling like they could ever regain control of Earth from humans. Well, in that scenario, could humans ever regain control from the Martians? That's a pretty vast power expanse between those two creatures. And so that's the power of analogy, is it can really draw us into that idea of the impossibility of humans in the face of the Martians, because we're like ants to humans when we're talking about humans to Martians in the analogy here. The next one is inference. By inference, we mean remembering to read between the lines and drawing conclusions that aren't literally or explicitly stated. So can we draw inferences? Yes, we have in our discussion about the story already, but what are some good examples of trying to make an inference? Well, in this example, the play never directly tells us what the Martians are here for on this planet. It doesn't say, oh, we figured out why they came here. It does state that they've studied us and then eventually decided to come here. But what was the reason? What did they find so interesting in their study of us? What do we infer by the lines spoken by Pearson in the play about the reason why Martians come here? Let's look at the lines. He says this on page 22. "I have seen the Martians feed. Should one of the machines appear over the tops of the trees, I am ready to fling myself flat on the earth." So we have to make an inference about why his reaction after witnessing the Martians feed or eat. Would he hide himself or pretend he was dead? And this one, when he responds to the stranger on page 23, and he says, "And we're eatable ants. I found that out." And he actually says this right after that analogy we just looked at. So when he says, he's using the imagery of the analogy that humans are ants. He says, well, we're eatable ants. So it'd be as if humans were eating ants. If we go back to that analogy from the prior slide, I found that out. What does he see? Well, the analogy here is that Martians were here to feed on humans. That's the reason he would fling himself to the ground to hide or to pretend he was dead, or the fact he says that we're eatable ants when he refers back to that stranger's analogy. And we have to make this inference because the play doesn't actually ever say, "And we realized that they were coming here to feed us all along." Now, the stranger does, in fairness, give his theory about the Martians raising humans like cattle. And so that might be another thing, but it's not as directly stated to say the Martians came here to harvest humans so that they could eat them. Okay? Now, that's the power of inference, is that we have to draw conclusions that aren't explicitly told to us. And there were several in the play, and here was a good example of one. Now, we can go and question authorship again in using the techniques to title their stories. So this one was titled War of the Worlds. An author must choose a title for his or her work. In our case, this was the title chosen by the original author, H.G. Wells, in The War of the Worlds, in his novel. But in this radio reproduction, we also have the same title, War of the Worlds. So, what's the title for? What's the story? Sorry, why is this story called War of the Worlds? And is it a good title? Well, what's the title for? I think it's meant to sort of capture the point of the story or bear reference to the story in some way, shape, or form in a major way. Okay? I mean, this story would suck if it was called Professor Pearson's Adventure. Right? I don't know. This story would suck if it was called, The Crazy Stranger or The Germ That Set Us Free or something. I mean, they're on topic, but they're not as good, because I think another title, point of a title, is that it has to kind of draw you into suspense as to what action is going to happen in that story, and does it seem to be worth my time. A title is the first thing somebody sees when they look into a story, generally, so it has to capture their attention enough to get a second reading and perhaps even convince them to read the story. So those are all those elements in there into looking as to why it is significant and important to think about what title you give to a work. All right. Number 2, why do you think this one's called War of the Worlds? Are there worlds at war? There's an attempt, for sure. Which worlds? Well, the world of Earth and the world of Mars. The Mars coming here and warring. War of the Worlds, Earth and Mars. Now, who loses? Earthlings do on their own planet. But, of course, the story doesn't necessarily end that way. Is it a good title, in your opinion? Does it have enough suspense? Does it give you enough clue as to what the story is about? Does it have enough mystery to make you interested in reading the story? Is it relevant enough to encapsulate the idea of the whole story? You think about it. Let me know if you want. But is War of the Worlds a good title to a story? And next time you see a title of a story, make that judgment. Is that a good title? Was that really a good title of the story? And there has to be some thought that goes into coming up with a title. Okay, I believe last we're looking at context clues. Context clues are when we read, we can sometimes use the context of a word that we might not know, or a phrase we might not know, to understand or figure out a likely definition of the word that we don't know. We use the context, we use the surrounding clues to get an idea of what it might mean. So I have a segment here that gives us an opportunity to practice this based on context, what we might think the word means. So we're going to look and try to figure out the meaning of the highlighted words here. Okay? So we may have seen these words before, by the way, and so we might think, oh, I've seen that word, I know what it means. But then when we fit it with the context, it doesn't make sense. So then we are faced with the possibility that word has an additional definition than what we thought it was. So let's go ahead and look. Before the cylinder fell, there was a general persuasion. And by the way, this text comes right from the conclusion of the story, from Professor Pearson's conclusion. And again, it sums up one of the themes of the story, which we'll talk about later. A general persuasion that through all the deep of space, no life existed beyond the petty surface of our minute sphere. Well, we have enough context there to define 3 words potentially. Before the cylinder fell, there was a general persuasion. What do you think that means? It doesn't mean to convince or persuade. There was this general, method of convincing people. Not really. It's more like an opinion, this general opinion, a general belief or a general consensus among people, or you could say a general conviction. But we don't necessarily use persuasion in that way. I've never used it that way. But it means kind of something different than to persuade or convince somebody. So there's this general agreement that through all the deeps of space, no life existed beyond Earth. So everybody thought that there was only life on planet Earth. How about petty? The petty surface of our minute sphere. And by the way, that's where I get Earth, minute sphere. That we're talking about the planet that we live on, this insignificant planet in the scope of all of the universe. Now, with that in mind, I get the idea that he means it's just this tiny little sphere, insignificant sphere in all of space. Why? Because he uses the word petty and minute. What does petty mean? Well, petty surface. It's insignificant, means insignificant, minor, unimportant. This kind of insignificant, by chance, little surface of this just so happened to be life inhabiting planet Earth. What about minute sphere or minute? Some of you might have read it. Oh, our minute sphere. Oh, 60 seconds, right? Well, minute. Okay, minute. We say it differently. Gives us an idea, oh, there must be a different definition because 60-second sphere doesn't make sense unless, you might think that, oh, he means the face of a clock. Well, the context clues would give us this idea. He's talking about Earth, and minute means small or unimportant, much like petty does. So petty and minute, unimportant, small, insignificant. Now we see further, so we understand more. Dim and wonderful is the vision I have conjured up in my mind of life spreading slowly from this little seabed of the solar system throughout the inanimate vastness of sidereal space. Conjured. Conjured. I've conjured up in my mind. So we use the context of conjured up in my mind of this vision that he then describes afterwards is this kind of idea that conjured must be to imagine in mind or to bring something to mind, to kind of project or call to mind an image to appear. Now you might have heard the word conjure before, except in a different context, like conjured up a spell, like a witch. Same idea. You kind of stir up or call to image or call to mind or something. Okay, you call into being, and that's what he does. He conjures in his mind. He calls up in an image in his mind of this idea that human life would spread throughout the universe. But that is a remote dream. This idea that humans, not Martians, will be the ones to kind of do interspace travel. But what about this? But that is a remote dream. Okay, you might think remote dream. I know what remote means. Remote means a device that controls something remotely. But if we're thinking in that context, that would be incorrect. So therefore, what could it be? A remote dream. Well, it would be more like a remote location or something that's out there far away. So we learn the context of which definition to use, and also the idea that it's kind of an impractical, far-off dream that may or may not ever happen. And that's the meaning of remote. So as you read in the future, as you carry on your reading, use context clues to help you figure out which definition's the proper definition, and even hints about words that you may never have seen before and you don't know the definition to, hints about what they might actually mean. And that's probably the way we learn the most majority of our words as we're reading is just through context. And we repeatedly see a word used in a certain way, and we get an idea of what that word must mean based on the clues surrounding the use of that word. From time to time, we may go and look it up in a dictionary, and then we have a couple other words to kind of interchange with it that give us an idea of its meaning. But a lot of the time, we just pick up on words by context, how they're used, and we know how to use a word because that's how others use it. That's how we read about it when we're seeing that word in text. And that's a really remarkable way of learning language that we have. And we do it naturally, but we can also try to do it intentionally. And the last thing I'll point out is when you come across a word you don't know, try to guess what it means by its context. Don't just slide over it as if you think you know it and pretending that it's not there. Acknowledge it. That's the way you learn language, and that's the way you develop your own vocabulary. Now you can either look up in a dictionary or give it your best guess by understanding its context usage.